A lot of people will tell you that going up against an HOA president is suicide. Are you kidding me? That is exactly what I screamed when I caught that HOA Karen driving her Cadillac Escalade across my grandfather's field for the 5th time this week. She said she had emergency shortcut rights through my private farmland for community benefit. Let me tell you, that is complete nonsense. Every morning I woke up in the middle of a Montana blizzard. I found fresh tire tracks destroying everything my family had worked to preserve for 3 generations. That woman was ruthless, self-righteous, and absolutely convinced she owned this entire territory. But what she did not know was that I had been recording everything, planning something that would put an end to her little joyrides forever. Let me tell you about the night when Karen's arrogance finally caught up with her. Comment below where you are watching from tonight. My name is Garrett Holloway, and I am the 3rd-generation owner of Holloway Farm, 160 acres that my grandfather purchased in 1946. That night, February 7th, 2025, I woke at 2:17 a.m. to a sound that did not belong in a storm. An engine, heavy, rumbling, the kind that belongs to a luxury SUV. I lay still for a moment, my breath visible in the cold bedroom air because the heating had been struggling all week. Then headlights swept across my ceiling like a searchlight, and I knew someone was driving through my field again. I crossed to the window in 3 steps, my bare feet hitting the icy wooden floor so hard that pain shot up through my ankles, through the frost-covered glass. I watched a black Cadillac Escalade plow straight across the south pasture, its tires carving deep wounds into frozen earth where no road had ever existed. This was the illegal shortcut someone had created through my property, connecting Pinewood Ridge Estates to the county highway and shaving 12 minutes off their precious commute. I watched the SUV hit my grandfather's fence line without slowing down. 3 posts snapped in rapid succession, the sound cutting through the howling wind like gunshots. Cedar posts he had set by hand in 1978, the year my father was born, now splintering under 2 tons of arrogance. The Escalade did not even break. It rolled over the fallen rails and continued across my land, as if the fence had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. I grabbed my jacket and boots, not bothering to lace them, and ran outside. By the time I reached the back porch, the taillights were already fading into the white curtain of snow. The cold hit me instantly, 18 below zero, and I felt the moisture in my nostrils freeze with my first breath. My fingers began to ache within seconds. That deep bone pain that warns you frostbite is only minutes away if you stay exposed. But I did not go back inside. I walked out into the field, following the tire tracks that cut across land my family had worked for nearly 80 years. The tracks were deep, at least 6 inches, and as I brushed away the fresh powder with my rapidly numbing hands, I discovered something that made my stomach drop. More tracks beneath, dozens of them, layered on top of each other like geological strata. A history of violation is written in frozen earth. I spent the next 40 minutes counting, my fingers turning white at the tips, my ears burning from the wind. 47, 47, separate times. Someone had driven across my property in the past month. When I finally stumbled back inside, I could not feel my hands at all, and I had to run them under lukewarm water for 10 minutes before the sensation returned in agonizing waves of pins and needles. But I had something more valuable than comfort. I had a number, 47 acts of trespass, each one a crime under Montana law. I went to the small office I had set up in what used to be Emma's sewing room, and I pulled up footage from the infrared camera I had installed 6 months ago to track deer. The camera had been busy. I scrolled through hundreds of clips until I found what I needed. A black Escalade, timestamp showing 3:14 a.m. on January 28th. License plate perfectly visible in the infrared light. I ran the plate through a public records search, and what I found made everything click into place. The vehicle was registered to Diane Whitmore, 55 years old, resident of Pinewood Ridge Estates, title president of the Pinewood Ridge Homeowners Association. I stared at the screen for a long moment, processing the implications. The HOA president herself was leading the charge across my land. Not some random resident taking a shortcut, but the woman who was supposed to enforce rules and maintain order in her own community. I looked at Emma's photograph on my desk, the one from our 10th anniversary, where she was laughing in the summer wind. She had wanted me to sell this farm after my father died. She had seen something coming that I had been too stubborn to recognize. Now she was gone, and I was here alone, facing exactly what she had feared. My eyes drifted to the old Caterpillar excavator sitting in the equipment shed, the same machine my grandfather had used to dig drainage trenches during the flood of '78. He always said that the machine saved the farm once. I pulled out the original land survey from 1946, the boundaries marked in his careful handwriting, and I studied them carefully. My property had existed for nearly 80 years, before Pinewood Ridge was even a concept. No easement had ever been granted. No right-of-way had ever been established. The HOA had exactly zero legal authority over my land. Yet here they were, treating it like their personal highway. The next morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox with official Pinewood Ridge HOA letterhead. Inside was a violation notice informing me that my farm fence did not meet community aesthetic standards. The fine was $500, deadline of 14 days. I read it twice, standing in the cold morning air, then looked out at the fresh tire tracks cutting across my south pasture. The woman who had personally destroyed my fence last night was now fining me for its appearance. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket. This was not random. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated attack, and I finally understood the rules of engagement. 3 days after I discovered Diane Whitmore's name on that license plate registration, I drove to the Pinewood Ridge Estates to confront her directly. The development sat on what used to be the Miller family's wheat fields. 200 acres sold off piece by piece until nothing remained but rows of identical McMansions with 3-car garages. The HOA clubhouse dominated the entrance, a building with floor-to-ceiling windows and a sign that read, "Pinewood Ridge, where community means excellence." I parked my 15-year-old Ford pickup between a Mercedes and a BMW, then walked inside feeling like I had crossed into enemy territory. The receptionist looked at me like I had tracked manure across her pristine marble floor. She asked if I had an appointment, made a phone call that lasted 5 minutes while I stood there dripping snowmelt, then directed me to a corner office at the end of a long hallway. Diane Whitmore was waiting behind a mahogany desk, a woman in her mid-50s with a smile that never reached her eyes. She gestured to a chair and said, "Mr. Holloway, I was wondering when you would stop by. Please, have a seat." I remained standing. I told her I had documented 47 instances of vehicles crossing my property without permission, and that I had identified her Escalade as a repeat offender. The trespassing would stop immediately, or I would be filing a complaint with the county sheriff. Diane's expression did not change. She leaned back and said, "Mr. Holloway, I think there has been a misunderstanding. Your property falls within our community's aesthetic influence zone. The county planning board approved this designation 6 months ago." I asked why I had never been notified, and she shrugged slightly. "Public hearings are posted in the county register. It is not our responsibility to hand-deliver notices to every adjacent landowner. Those who pay attention to civic matters would have seen it." The condescension in her voice was barely concealed. She continued, saying my property was now subject to certain standards and cooperative arrangements that benefited the greater community. I asked what that had to do with people driving across my land. She replied that the shortcut through my south pasture had been identified as a potential emergency access route, and that the HOA had been documenting its use for future consideration. I almost laughed. Emergency access route. My south pasture was a frozen field, with no lighting, no signage, no paved surface, nothing that any reasonable person would consider safe for emergency vehicles. A fire truck trying to navigate that terrain in a blizzard would get stuck within 50 feet. This was not about emergencies. This was about convenience, about wealthy people who believed their time was more valuable than my property rights. I told her there was no easement. There had never been an easement, and my family had owned that land since 1946. Diane's smile flickered, replaced by something harder beneath the surface. She said, "Mr. Holloway, I understand you are attached to your farm. But progress does not stop for sentiment. Pinewood Ridge is expanding, and your property sits in the path of our Phase 2 development. The smart move would be to accept the offer we will be making you soon. The alternative is unpleasant for everyone." I asked what offer, and she waved dismissively, saying the details were being finalized, but I would find it generous. I told her my land was not for sale. Not now, not ever. As I reached the door, she called out, "Do not forget that $500 fine. 11 days remaining, and I suspect more violations will be identified soon. Our standards are quite rigorous." I walked out without responding. My hands clenched so tight my knuckles ached. I drove straight to Beckett's Hardware and Supply, a store that had served the farming community for over 50 years. Ray Beckett was behind the counter, a weathered man in his late 60s who had known my grandfather. He took one look at my face and said, "You finally met Diane Whitmore." I asked how he knew, and he laughed without humor. He said everyone in the old farming community knew about Diane. She had pushed 3 families to sell in the past 2 years, using fines and regulations until they gave up. The Hendersons held out 18 months before they finally broke. Ray leaned closer and lowered his voice. "She is married to Harold Whitmore. He sits on the county planning board, that aesthetic influence zone. He pushed it through during a summer session when half the board was on vacation. No public discussion, no opposition." He paused, glancing toward the door as if checking we were alone. "Here is what worries me. Garrett, they are not just harassing you, they are building something. Every time someone drives across your land, it gets documented somewhere. Every time you do not physically stop them, it strengthens their position. Montana law has provisions for what they call a prescriptive easement. If they can establish a pattern of use that looks public, looks continuous, looks unopposed, eventually a judge might rule in their favor. It is a long game, and they are patient." I asked how long, and he said the statutory period was 5 years of continuous use, but cases had been won with less if the documentation was persuasive enough. "They are not advertising what they are doing," Ray added. "But I have seen this before. By the time you realize what happened, it is too late." I thanked Ray and drove home as the sun set behind the mountains. This was not a neighbor dispute. This was a coordinated campaign to steal my land through legal manipulation. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw fresh tire tracks cutting across the south pasture. Over the next 2 hours, I watched 4 more SUVs come through, all displaying Pinewood Ridge stickers on their windshields. They were not hiding anymore. They were establishing their claim one trespass at a time, building their case in plain sight, while betting I would never figure out the game until it was already over. The morning after my confrontation with Diane, I drove to the county hardware store and purchased 6 motion-activated trail cameras, along with a dozen metal signs reading, "Private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted." I spent the entire afternoon installing them along the southern boundary, working in temperatures around 10 degrees below zero. By nightfall, I had a surveillance network covering every possible entry point from Pinewood Ridge. Over the next 3 days, those cameras recorded 23 separate vehicles crossing my property. Every single one displayed an HOA parking sticker. But what disturbed me was not just the number, it was the pattern. Each driver slowed as they approached my new signs, read them clearly, then accelerated through anyway. Several of them pointed at the cameras and laughed. One woman in a white Range Rover actually waved. This was not ignorance or indifference. This was coordinated defiance, a message being sent with every tire track carved into my frozen field. On the 4th day, I took my evidence to the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Dale Morrow was a man in his late 50s with gray hair and the careful demeanor of someone who had learned to navigate local politics. I spread photographs across his desk, showed him video timestamps, and explained the systematic nature of the trespass. He listened patiently, then leaned back and sighed. "Mr. Holloway, what you are describing is a civil matter, not criminal. Trespassing in Montana is a misdemeanor, requiring proof of intent to commit an additional crime. People driving across land to save commute time is a property dispute. You need a lawyer." I pressed him, asking if 47 documented violations meant nothing. His eyes flickered briefly toward a framed photograph on his wall, showing him shaking hands with several men in suits at what looked like a ribbon-cutting ceremony. I recognized the Pinewood Ridge clubhouse in the background. "Document everything," he said, his tone final. "Build your case. Take it to civil court." I understood then that I would find no allies in the county government. Whatever relationships Diane and Harold Whitmore had cultivated, they extended further than I had realized. 2 days later, I learned exactly what Diane meant by unpleasant for everyone. Ray Beckett called at 7:15 a.m., his voice tight. He said I needed to check my mailbox immediately. A sympathetic postal worker had forwarded me a copy of a letter Diane had sent to all 200 households in Pinewood Ridge. The letter, printed on official HOA letterhead, claimed I had been threatening community safety by blocking a public roadway in continuous use for over 5 years. It accused me of installing intimidating surveillance equipment aimed at residents and urged everyone to document any aggressive behavior on my part. 5 years of continuous use. The claim landed like a cold stone in my stomach. I knew for certain the path had only appeared 8 months ago. This was not harassment anymore. This was Diane laying the legal groundwork for something much larger. And the brazenness of the lie told me how confident she was that no one would challenge it. I hired a licensed surveyor named Tom Fredericks, a professional with 30 years of experience who had worked for the county assessor's office. He spent 2 days on my property with GPS equipment and historical records, comparing every boundary marker against the original 1946 land patent. His report was definitive. No easement existed. The boundaries matched the original survey exactly, with no evidence of any historical road or access route. But Tom discovered something else that shifted my understanding of what I was facing. He had pulled county records and found that another surveying company had submitted a report on my property 6 months earlier. That report claimed to have found evidence of a historical access road dating to 1980, allegedly used continuously for over 40 years. Tom said the report was professionally formatted but riddled with technical errors any competent surveyor would recognize. This has not been officially verified or accepted by the county yet, he explained. It is sitting in a queue waiting for review, but once it gets rubber stamped, and these things usually do unless someone objects, it becomes part of the official record. Someone is betting you will never find out until it is too late. The company that produced the fraudulent report was called Mountain West Land Services, incorporated just 8 months ago. Its registered agent was a Helena law firm specializing in real estate development. The listed office address was a vacant lot. Everything about this operation was designed to create a paper trail that would eventually be used to take my land through legal channels. Diane was not simply trying to harass me into selling. She was constructing a fiction that would give her what she wanted, regardless of my consent. I felt something shift inside me as I processed this. The anger was still there, but it had transformed into something colder, more focused. If they wanted to fight with paperwork and bureaucracy, I would learn their game and beat them at it. That evening, while reviewing camera footage, an email notification appeared on my screen. The sender was a string of random numbers at a free email service, completely anonymous. No subject line. The message contained a single sentence: check the HOA financial records. Where did the money go? I read it 3 times, feeling the weight of what it implied. Someone inside Pinewood Ridge knew something Diane wanted kept hidden, and they had decided to point me toward it. The anonymous email about HOA finances haunted me for days. Before I could investigate, I decided to get ahead of Diane's next move. Based on the pattern of her attacks, I anticipated she would target my financial relationships. So I called First Mountain Bank that Monday morning to discuss extending my operating loan early, hoping to lock it in before she could interfere. I was too late. The loan officer, a young man who had replaced old Bill Henderson last year, informed me that my extension request could not be processed. An official complaint had been filed with the bank's compliance office by the Pinewood Ridge HOA, alleging that I was subject to pending easement litigation and outstanding property violations. The complaint included documentation that made my farm appear legally encumbered. The letter was dated 2 weeks earlier. Before I had even received my first violation notice, Diane had moved against my credit while I was still trying to understand the game. I asked to speak with the branch manager and was told she was unavailable. Her name, according to the placard on the empty office, was Diane Whitmore, former branch manager, the loan officer clarified. She had left 3 years ago, but she clearly retained influence over lending decisions. That same week, 3 additional violation notices arrived from the HOA, each designed to drain my resources through cumulative fines. My horse barn from 1952 failed to meet architectural standards. My tractor constituted visual pollution. My private driveway required streetlights I had never needed in 80 years. Total penalties: $2,750, due in 21 days, with liens threatened for noncompliance. I did not waste energy on outrage. Instead, I photographed each notice, logged them in a spreadsheet with dates and alleged violations, and began building a record of harassment that would eventually become evidence. If Diane wanted to create a paper trail, I would create one of my own. The pattern was clear now. She was attacking on multiple fronts simultaneously, overwhelming my capacity to respond while manufacturing documentation for future legal action. Ray Beckett arrived at my farm that evening with a manila folder and a grim expression. He had been calling in favors from people who remembered this valley before developers arrived. Inside the folder were photocopied HOA financial documents leaked by someone Ray refused to identify. The numbers were damning. Pinewood Ridge collected approximately $1.2 million annually in fees, but official expenses totaled only $680,000. Over $520,000 had vanished across 3 years, flowing into contracts with companies that traced back to Harold Whitmore's consulting firm. "They are stealing from their own residents," Ray said quietly. "The anonymous email was pointing you here." I studied the documents with growing clarity. This was not just about my land. Diane and Harold had built a system of extraction that depended on maintaining control. My farm was an obstacle to their expansion plans, but their financial fraud was the vulnerability that could bring them down. The next morning, I called Nina Carver, a property lawyer whose name Ray had provided. She specialized in disputes that other attorneys considered too politically sensitive. Her office was in a converted farmhouse 20 miles outside town, far from county politics. Nina was sharp-eyed, late 30s, and she listened to my entire account without interruption. When I finished, she told me she had personal experience with HOA abuse. A different association had tried to force her parents off generational land using identical tactics. "Prescriptive easement is their primary weapon," she explained. "Montana law requires 5 years of continuous, uninterrupted public use, but there is a critical weakness they hope you never discover. If you demonstrate clear, documented opposition to the trespass, even a single successful act of blocking access, their timeline resets to 0. One defensible interruption destroys years of manufactured evidence." She agreed to take my case and immediately began filing public records requests for the Aesthetic Influence Zone documentation and County Planning Board voting records. We were building a counteroffensive, while Diane believed I was simply absorbing punishment. Driving home that evening, I stopped at my south pasture and studied the tire tracks crisscrossing the frozen field. My grandfather's voice came back to me, describing the flood of 1978, when he spent 3 days on the old Caterpillar, digging drainage trenches 2 meters deep. The ice that winter froze so hard in those channels that they held their shape until spring. An idea began forming, something requiring careful planning and precise execution. That night, I found a new message in my inbox, not anonymous this time, but a forwarded copy of the Pinewood Ridge community newsletter. Diane had published an article that stopped just short of a direct accusation. It expressed concern about a neighboring property owner who had recently experienced personal tragedy and might benefit from community support during this difficult time. It noted that some residents had observed erratic behavior and suggested maintaining an appropriate distance for everyone's safety. It never used my name, but the description was unmistakable to anyone who knew the situation. The language was carefully crafted to sound compassionate while planting seeds of fear and suspicion. She was not just attacking my finances anymore. She was methodically destroying my reputation, turning me into someone the community would be relieved to see gone. I saved the newsletter and added it to my growing file. Every attack she launched was another piece of evidence for the case Nina and I were building in silence. Diane's newsletter article spread through the community faster than the winter wind. The effect became undeniable 3 days later, when I walked into the grocery store and the cashier who had known me for 15 years refused to meet my eyes. She processed my items in complete silence, her hands trembling slightly as she handed back my change. That single interaction told me everything I needed to know about how the rest of the town now viewed me. The carefully worded concern in Diane's article had transformed me from a respected, third-generation landowner into someone the community regarded with suspicion. 847 people had received that newsletter, and each one now carried a distorted image of me constructed from implication and innuendo. Conversations stopped when I entered public spaces. Familiar faces turned away. I had become a stranger in the place my family had called home for nearly 80 years, and the isolation cut deeper than any Montana winter. The fourth night of the blizzard brought temperatures down to 22 degrees below zero, and I made a decision that nearly cost me everything. I had been watching my cameras when headlights appeared around 11:30 p.m. and barely visible through the horizontal snow. Something inside me broke. I grabbed my coat and positioned myself in the path of the oncoming SUV, certain the driver would stop when he saw a human figure. But the blizzard had reduced visibility to less than 30 feet, and the vehicle was moving fast, its license plate obscured by caked ice and snow. The driver did not slow down until the last possible second. The SUV swerved hard, missing me by less than 3 feet, spraying frozen debris across my face. Through the howling wind, I heard a man's voice screaming something about psychos and getting off the road. Then he was gone, swallowed by the white darkness, probably believing the storm had hidden what just happened. I stood there shaking, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I walked back to the house slowly, my legs unsteady from cold and adrenaline. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at Emma's photograph. She had warned me about this. 2 years before she died, she had said something I could never forget. Do not let this farm consume you the way it consumed your father. And my father had died of a heart attack in 1995, 3 months after a developer tried to force him into selling through legal harassment. The stress had destroyed him. Now I was walking the same path, fighting the same battle, and I could feel the weight pressing down on my chest. For the first time since this began, I wondered if Emma had been right. Maybe some fights were not worth winning. The next morning, despite roads that had been closed for 2 days, a county vehicle managed to reach my driveway. The social worker explained that emergency protocols required immediate response to reports involving children, regardless of weather conditions. She had driven 40 miles through the storm because an anonymous complaint alleged I had displayed concerning behavior toward minors in the neighboring community. I invited her inside, answered every question honestly, showed her I lived alone, that no children had ever been on my property, and that I had no criminal record. After 2 hours, she seemed satisfied the complaint was baseless. But she warned me the report would remain in their system for 7 years. Even a false accusation leaves a permanent mark. As she drove away, I understood that Diane had crossed a line I had not anticipated. She was no longer trying to take my land. She was trying to destroy me completely, using the most devastating weapon available against a man living alone. That evening, a second anonymous email arrived through a temporary encrypted service, the kind that automatically deletes messages after they are read. The sender had taken precautions to remain untraceable, but the opening words revealed everything. I am Harold. He wrote that his wife had lost control and was making decisions he could not support. The prescriptive easement documentation she filed with the county was fabricated. He possessed the original survey, proving no historical road existed, but he could not come forward because Diane held evidence of things he had done, things that would end his career and marriage. I am trapped, he wrote, but I do not want to see an innocent man destroyed because of her obsession. The message disappeared from my screen 60 seconds after I finished reading, but I had already memorized every word. Harold Whitmore was offering me a weapon while remaining safely in the shadows. I needed to move, to think, to find clarity. I walked to the equipment shed where my grandfather's Caterpillar excavator sat beneath decades of dust. The machine had not run since 1992, but I climbed into the cab anyway and settled into the cracked leather seat. My hands found the worn steering controls, smoothed by my grandfather's grip over countless hours of work. That was when I noticed the words carved into the metal frame beside the ignition. This land never belongs to anyone who will not stand on it. He had written that in 1978, the year he saved the farm from the flood by digging drainage trenches for 3 days without rest. I sat in the cold darkness, thinking about my father, about Emma, about every blow I had absorbed in the past weeks. Then I pulled out my phone and called Nina. When she answered, I said only 6 words. We are going on offense now. Nina Carver arrived at my farm the morning after my call, with a folder thick with documents and a warning. What you are planning is legally defensible only if you follow every step exactly, she said, spreading papers across my kitchen table. Montana law protects property owners who take reasonable measures to secure their land. But the line between protection and entrapment is thin. Every hazard must be warned. Every danger must be discoverable. No hidden traps. No surprises that a jury could interpret as malicious intent. I told her I understood. She studied my face for a long moment, then handed me a checklist, certified warning signs meeting Department of Transportation standards, written notices via certified mail, and complete photographic documentation. I have seen what Diane Whitmore does to people, she said quietly. If you are going to fight back, we do it right. I spent the next 2 days transforming my south pasture into a fortress. The Caterpillar excavator had sat dormant since 1992, but my grandfather had built machines to last. After cleaning the engine and replacing what needed replacing, the old beast roared to life with a sound that echoed across the frozen fields like a declaration. I drove it to the south boundary and began carving a channel 60 meters long, 1.2 meters deep, and 2 meters wide. Directly across the path the HOA residents had claimed as their shortcut. The frozen ground fought back, but the blade was relentless. By evening, I had exposed the water table. At 20 degrees below zero, the seeping groundwater froze almost immediately, transforming the trench into a barrier of solid ice that would hold until spring. The defenses went up the following day with careful attention to Nina's requirements. At the main crossing point, I installed a steel gate with heavy-gauge barbed wire stretched at bumper height, gleaming and impossible to miss. I positioned 2 large containers packed with ice blocks along the trench edges, reinforcing the frozen walls, along the secondary crossing areas where determined drivers might attempt to bypass the gate. I laid coils of barbed wire just beneath the snow surface, positioned to shred the tires of any vehicle that ignored the warnings. But these were not hidden traps. Every 10 meters, I posted bright orange signs reading, "Warning subsurface hazards, barbed wire present, no vehicle access." Anyone who drove through would do so with full knowledge of what lay beneath. The choice, and the consequences, would be entirely their own. Documentation was critical, so I handled it systematically. I hired a photographer with a drone to capture every sign, every meter of trench, every strand of wire in a single comprehensive session. Nina's paralegal had prepared 53 identical certified letters in advance, each addressed to a documented trespasser, stating that hazardous land work was underway and that unauthorized vehicle entry would result in damage and potential injury. I signed them that evening and dropped the entire batch at the post office's commercial window, where the clerk processed them with mechanical efficiency. Copies of every receipt went into a folder that was growing thicker by the day. If this ever went to court, no one would be able to claim ignorance. While I fortified my land, Nina had been dismantling Diane's legal foundation. She called that evening with news that shifted everything. "The Freedom of Information request came back," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "I have the original voting records from the county planning board meeting where the aesthetic influence zone was approved. Garrett, Harold Whitmore's signature on the approval document is forged. Flight records show he was at a conference in Seattle that day. He was not even in the state. The handwriting does not match his verified signatures from other county documents." I sat down heavily, processing the implications. Forgery of a public document was a felony under Montana Statute 45-6-203, carrying a maximum sentence of 10 years. And there was only one person with both the motive and the access to sign Harold's name on county planning records. 2 hours later, the final piece arrived through Harold's encrypted channel. He had attached a scanned file, the original survey his wife had commissioned, the one proving no historical road existed on my property. He had kept it hidden in a safety deposit box, insurance against the day her schemes collapsed. "Use it," his message read, "but protect me if you can. I was weak, not criminal." I saved the file and added it to our evidence folder. We now possessed proof of financial fraud exceeding $500,000, forged county documents, fabricated survey reports, a false CPS complaint, and a systematic campaign to steal land through manufactured legal claims. The question was no longer whether we could expose Diane Whitmore. It was how to do it in a way that would destroy her credibility permanently while protecting those she had trapped in her web of manipulation. I stood at my window that night, watching moonlight reflect off the frozen trench guarding my southern boundary. The ice gleamed like a blade laid across the earth. Somewhere in Pinewood Ridge, Diane was planning her next assault, confident that I was still absorbing blows, still playing defense. She had no idea that the battlefield had changed. Nina had confirmed that the next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and Montana law required such meetings to be open to all parties involved in pending disputes. I intended to attend. I intended to speak Yimulk, and I intended to bring every piece of evidence we had gathered, presenting it before the community Diane believed she controlled. The trench would stop her vehicles. The truth would stop everything else. The day after I finished the trench, Diane made her first attempt to block me from the Thursday meeting. An email went out to all Pinewood Ridge residents announcing that, due to security concerns, The upcoming HOA session would be restricted to registered homeowners only. Nina intercepted a copy and called me immediately. She is trying to shut you out, but Montana statute 35-2-123 requires HOA meetings to be open to all parties, with pending disputes affecting the association. You have documented trespass claims against over 50 of their residents. She cannot legally exclude you. I had anticipated this move. Before Nina could suggest our next step, I told her I wanted to deliver the response in person, with a notary witness, making sure Diane saw my face when she realized her maneuver had failed. Nina agreed. By Wednesday afternoon, after we hand-delivered our demand letter citing the statute, Diane had no choice but to confirm the meeting would be open to the public. Her tone made it clear. She understood the battle lines had been drawn. Wednesday evening, Nina and I assembled our evidence package in her farmhouse office. Rather than presenting isolated documents, we had constructed a narrative arc that would guide the audience from confusion to outrage. The surveillance footage established the crime. 47 crossings captured on camera, with timestamps and visible license plates. Tom Frederick's surveyor report demolished the legal foundation, proving no easement had ever existed. From there, the fraudulent filings from Mountain West Land Services revealed the deliberate deception, a shell company created solely to manufacture false history. The forged signature on county planning documents transformed the story from civil dispute to criminal conspiracy, especially when paired with airline records proving Harold was in Seattle that day. The HOA financial discrepancy, $520,000 funneled to Harold's consulting firm, exposed the motive behind everything, and the CPS letter confirming my case was baseless, demonstrating how far Diane would go to destroy anyone who stood in her way. Each piece built on the last, until the pattern became undeniable. Thursday morning brought an unexpected development. My landline rang at 7:45 a.m., the caller ID showing an unfamiliar number. Harold Whitmore's voice came through, strained and hurried. He explained he was calling from a prepaid phone he had purchased at a gas station 2 towns over, afraid Diane monitored their home lines. He had seen the certified letter Nina sent and understood what was coming. He wanted to make a deal. If I agreed not to pursue criminal charges against him for his role in the financial schemes, he would testify publicly about everything Diane had done. He would confirm the forged signature, the fabricated surveys, and the systematic harassment. I was weak, he said. I let her drag me into things I knew were wrong, but I never wanted anyone to lose their home. That was always her obsession. I told him I would discuss it with my lawyer, but I already knew the answer. Harold's testimony would be devastating, and prosecuting him might silence other potential witnesses. The architect deserved the punishment, not the tools she had manipulated. That afternoon, I made 2 calls that would ensure the meeting became more than a neighborhood dispute. The first was to a regional television station, whose assignment editor had covered HOA controversies before. She was skeptical until I mentioned forged government documents and $500,000 in missing funds. A reporter and camera crew were already in the area covering storm preparations, she said, and could easily extend their stay. The second call went to an independent journalist who specialized in local government corruption. He recognized the prescriptive easement pattern immediately. Most victims never figure out what happened until it is too late, he said. Your story could help a lot of people. Both confirmed they would attend Thursday evening. The forecast called for the worst blizzard of the season, with temperatures dropping to 25 degrees below zero and visibility reduced to near zero. Most residents would stay home, but Diane would not miss a meeting where her authority faced challenge. More importantly, I knew which route she would take. The shortcut through my south pasture was faster than the main road, especially when weather slowed traffic. She had used it for months without consequence. The blizzard would reduce her visibility to 50 feet or less, making the warning signs harder to spot until she was already committed to the crossing. She had not checked her mail. She had not seen my certified letters. She had no idea what waited beneath the fresh powder covering my south pasture. At 6:15 p.m., I sat in my truck at the edge of my property, dashcam angled toward the south approach. The storm had arrived in full force. Snow falling so thick the world became a wall of white beyond my headlights. I had positioned myself carefully, far enough from the trench to avoid any suggestion of entrapment, close enough to document whatever happened next. The warning signs were there, reflective letters catching light whenever the wind shifted the curtain of snow, but someone driving fast might not process them in time. That was not my problem. I had followed every legal requirement. The choice to ignore them belonged to whoever came through. At 6:22 p.m., I checked the time and calculated. The meeting started at 7. If Diane left Pinewood Ridge now, taking her usual route, she would reach my property in approximately 8 minutes. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The 47 violations, the forged documents, the false accusations, the campaign to destroy my reputation and steal the land my grandfather had purchased with 20 years of railroad wages. Emma had warned me this farm would consume me the way it consumed my father. But she had not lived to see me learn how to fight back without losing myself in the process. At 6:29 p.m., headlights cut through the swirling darkness from the direction of Pinewood Ridge. They were moving fast, too fast for the conditions, following the path that dozens of vehicles had carved through my land over the past months. The distinctive silhouette of a Cadillac Escalade emerged from the storm, its driver clearly confident in a route she had taken countless times before. Diane Whitmore was heading home to change before the meeting, taking her shortcut one final time. The trench lay directly in her path, invisible under fresh snow, waiting with the patience of frozen earth. I adjusted my camera and watched her approach. In approximately 90 seconds, everything was going to change. The Cadillac Escalade hit the trench at approximately 45 miles per hour. Diane was running late. I realized later, rushing home to change before the meeting she intended to dominate. Overconfidence and poor visibility made her push harder through the storm than any rational driver would. The front wheels dropped suddenly into the frozen channel, and the vehicle's momentum did the rest. Metal screamed against frozen earth as the hood crumpled, both airbags deploying in a white explosion. The SUV came to rest at a sharp angle, front end buried in ice, rear wheels spinning uselessly against snow. Steam rose from the ruptured radiator, mixing with swirling snowflakes. I did not move from my truck. I did not approach. I reached for my phone and dialed 911, reporting a single vehicle accident on private property. Sheriff Dale Morrow arrived 17 minutes later. He stepped out and surveyed the scene, taking in the warning signs. The trench, the trapped Escalade with its president still inside. Diane had escaped with minor bruising from the airbag, but she was screaming at anyone within earshot, demanding I be arrested for assault, entrapment, and attempted murder. Morrow listened without expression, then walked my property perimeter, photographing every posted warning. When he returned to his cruiser, he began writing an accident report that would become part of the official record. Vehicle operating on private property without authorization. No legal right-of-way exists. The driver ignored posted warnings of hazardous conditions. For the first time, law enforcement had formally documented that no public road existed through my land. Diane's prescriptive easement claim had just been destroyed by her own recklessness. A tow truck extracted the Escalade in a process that took 40 minutes and left Diane standing in the snow, her designer coat ruined. I drove past without stopping, heading toward the Pinewood Ridge clubhouse. Despite the storm, the parking lot was surprisingly full. Most residents lived within walking distance of the clubhouse, and word of the confrontation had spread through the development all week. The television crew had arrived hours earlier, while roads were still passable, and the independent journalist had been in town since Wednesday. When I walked through the doors at 7:32 p.m., 85 residents turned to face me. The vice president was fumbling through procedural matters, stalling, hoping Diane would arrive to take control. She would not be coming anytime soon. Nina had arranged for me to address the assembly under the dispute resolution clause. I stood at the front of the room and began presenting our case, not as a list of accusations, but as a story the audience could follow. I started with the surveillance footage showing their neighbors driving across my land, then introduced the surveyor's report, proving no historical road existed. From there, I explained how Mountain West Land Services had been created as a shell company to manufacture false evidence, and how airline records proved Harold was in Seattle on the day someone forged his signature on county documents. I cited the relevant statute and its 10-year maximum sentence. Then I showed them where their money had gone. $520,000 missing from HOA fees, funneled into contracts with Harold's consulting firm. The room fell completely silent. Harold Whitmore rose from his seat in the third row. His face was pale, but his voice steady. He confirmed everything, admitted his wife had forged his signature without his knowledge, and acknowledged the consulting contracts were designed to hide money. Diane controlled. He apologized for his weakness and his failure to act sooner. The residents stared with expressions ranging from shock to fury. These were people who had paid thousands, believing their fees maintained the community. Instead, their president had stolen from them. The journalist's pen moved rapidly. The television camera captured every reaction. At 8:17 p.m., Diane Whitmore burst through the clubhouse doors. She was unrecognizable from the polished woman who had threatened me in her office weeks earlier. Mud and melting snow covered her ruined clothes. Her hair hung in wet tangles. Her eyes darted around the room with something beyond anger, something closer to desperation. When she saw me at the podium, saw her husband with his head bowed, saw the evidence displayed behind me, she did not scream. She laughed, a high, brittle sound that made several residents step back. "You think you have won?" she said, her voice cracking. "You think any of this matters? That farm is a cancer. 15%. Every year it sits there. Your homes lose 15%. I was cutting it out. I was saving you." She stumbled forward, grabbing the arm of a resident who tried to move past her. "I was saving all of you, and this is how you repay me." The woman pulled away, and Diane stood alone in the center of the room, finally seeing herself reflected in the horrified faces of people she had believed were her allies. A resident in the back called for an immediate vote of no confidence. The motion was seconded instantly. The vote was 73-12 in favor of removal. Diane Whitmore was stripped of her presidency effective immediately. She remained frozen as residents filed past without eye contact, receiving the same treatment she had orchestrated against me weeks earlier. After the room cleared, Sheriff Morrow approached me near the exit. His expression had changed, neutrality replaced by something like respect. "The county prosecutor reviewed the materials you submitted in advance," he said. "Given the volume of documented fraud and the severity of the forgery charges, they are opening a formal criminal investigation first thing tomorrow. This is not over, Mr. Holloway, but I think you already knew that. The criminal investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within 3 weeks, the county prosecutor had assembled enough evidence to file charges against Diane Whitmore on 3 counts. Forgery of public documents under Montana Statute 45-6-203, financial fraud involving HOA funds, and filing a false report with Child Protective Services. The forgery charge alone carried a potential 10-year sentence. Her attorney negotiated aggressively, but the evidence was overwhelming. In the end, Diane accepted a plea deal that included 18 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, a lifetime ban from holding any HOA position in the state of Montana, and full restitution. She was ordered to pay me $47,500 in damages covering the fraudulent fines, fence destruction, and legal fees I had incurred fighting her campaign. The check arrived by certified mail 6 weeks after sentencing. I deposited it without ceremony. The financial audit of Pinewood Ridge HOA revealed even more extensive fraud than we had documented. An independent accounting firm traced $520,000 in misappropriated funds over 3 years, all flowing through shell contracts to Harold Whitmore's consulting firm. The new HOA board, elected in an emergency session the week after Diane's removal, voted unanimously to pursue civil recovery. Harold cooperated fully, providing bank records and contract documentation that accelerated the process. In exchange for his testimony and cooperation, he avoided criminal prosecution, though his reputation and marriage did not survive. Diane filed for divorce 2 months after her sentencing. Citing irreconcilable differences, Harold moved to a small apartment in Helena and took a job with a construction company, far from the development schemes that had defined his career. I heard he was doing honest work for the first time in years. The community response surprised me. 12 residents of Pinewood Ridge sent handwritten letters apologizing for their behavior during the months when Diane's newsletter had turned me into a pariah. Some admitted they had driven across my property themselves, following the crowd without questioning whether it was right. Others confessed they had believed the rumors about my mental state and regretted not seeking the truth before judging me. I read each letter carefully, then filed them away. Forgiveness would take time, but acknowledgement was a start. The grocery store cashier who had refused to meet my eyes began greeting me by name again. The farmers who had crossed the street now nodded when we passed. The whispers stopped. I was no longer the unstable man from the Holloway place. I was the man who had stood his ground and won. Sheriff Dale Morrow came to my farm on a Saturday morning in late March, after the snow had finally begun to melt. He was not there on official business. He brought 2 cups of coffee from the diner in town and stood with me on the porch, looking out at the south pasture where the trench was slowly filling with spring meltwater. "I should have acted sooner," he said, his voice carrying genuine regret. I knew something was wrong with how that development operated. I saw the complaints from other landowners, but I told myself it was not my jurisdiction, that these were civil matters for lawyers to sort out. I was wrong. I accepted his apology, but told him the truth. Next time someone comes to you with evidence of systematic harassment, do not wait for them to dig a trench before you take it seriously. He nodded slowly and promised he would not make the same mistake twice. The restoration of my property took most of the spring. I hired a fencing company to install a new barrier along the entire southern boundary. Steel posts set in concrete with heavy-gauge wire that would last decades. The cost was $18,000, covered entirely by the HOA settlement as part of their civil liability. Where the ice trench had been, I planted a row of willow saplings that would grow into a living fence, a permanent natural boundary that no vehicle could cross. My grandfather's Caterpillar excavator, the machine that had saved the farm twice, now received a full restoration. When it was finished, gleaming in fresh paint, I donated it to the Regional Agricultural Museum with a plaque explaining its history. This machine protected Holloway Farm in 1978 and 2025. Some land is worth defending. The final act of closure came on a warm afternoon in early April. I walked to the southern boundary carrying the original survey marker from 1946, the one I had found buried when digging the trench. It was a simple iron post with my grandfather's initials stamped into the metal, placed there nearly 80 years ago when he first claimed this land as his own. I had it cleaned and treated, then encased in a protective acrylic sleeve that would shield it from weather for generations. I drove it back into the earth at the exact spot indicated on the original land patent, the corner where my property met what had once been Miller Land and was now Pinewood Ridge. As I tamped the soil around it, I spoke aloud to Emma, whose photograph I had brought with me. "You were right that this farm almost consumed me, but you were also right that some things are worth fighting for. I found a way to do both." That evening, I received an email from the Montana Farmers Association inviting me to speak at their annual conference. The topic they proposed was property rights and defense against HOA overreach. Apparently, my story had circulated through the agricultural community, and landowners across the state wanted to hear how I had fought back. I accepted immediately. The techniques I had learned, the legal strategies Nina had taught me, the importance of documentation and patience, and refusing to be intimidated, these were lessons that could help others facing similar battles. Not everyone would need to dig a trench, but everyone deserved to know that the law protected those who stood their ground. I walked out to the porch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The willow saplings along the south boundary were already showing their first green buds. The new fence gleamed in the fading light. Somewhere in town, Diane Whitmore was completing her community service hours, picking up trash along the highway she had once considered beneath her. Justice had been served, not through violence or revenge, but through evidence, procedure, and the simple refusal to surrender what was rightfully mine. My grandfather had written that this land never belonged to anyone who would not stand on it. I had stood, and I was still standing. If you have ever faced someone who believed the rules did not apply to them, someone who used power and influence to take what was not theirs, I hope this story showed you that fighting back is possible. Document everything, know your rights, find allies who understand the system, and never let anyone convince you that your dignity is not worth defending. If this story resonated with you, consider supporting Karma Fence so we can continue sharing stories of ordinary people who refuse to be pushed around. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, sometimes the best fence you can build is the one that proves you were right all along.